So this question is from one of our Patreon supporters, and it's about shadow work and specifically how it relates to plant medicine work. I think always it's very interesting to first look at the etymology of words. So this idea of shadow, from my understanding, it's shade. Also very interesting, I think etymologically, it has to do with anything that's unreal and also anything that follows you around. That's essentially what a shadow does, is it follows you around. But it's also seen that there's something unreal about it. And I think in a lot of spiritual traditions, it has to do with this idea of Maya, or in a Christian sense, the apocalypse, to lift up the veil and to see the world as it actually is, which at the root of plant medicine work is, I would say, fundamentally what plant medicine work is about. It's about truth. It's about understanding oneself, to know thyself. But shadow work is interesting in that it's specifically saying this idea of going into the shadow, going into that which is unreal, so that we can find that which is real, so that we can find the truth. Often in a lot of spiritual practices or plant medicine ceremonies, there's often this idea of love and light and rainbows and unicorns, and that's a very vital part of this work. That's half of this work, is that experience of light, of beauty, of joy. Those are very profound experiences, very meaningful experiences. You have traditions, from what I understand, like the Huni Queen, for example, who will often have this idea of, in Portuguese and in Brazil, where they're from, this idea of só alegria, so only joy, only happiness, always keeping our focus on that. And there's something very powerful to that. I think that's often understated in this work as well, of where our intention is, where we're focusing our mind. At the same time, another example of a group of people who I've worked with, the Shipibo people, very often people describe them as kind of masters of shadow work. Even the ceremonies tend to happen at night in the darkness, in the shadow. And it's this idea of really going into the darkness. Often I use the analogy of martial arts, and even when I studied martial arts, I very much found these ideas very beautiful of leverage, of using one's energy against them. But what I also realized, at least for myself, is I think those things are not attainable unless we go into the shadow of that. In reference to martial arts, I think one can only learn those principles through the opposite of that, through the ideas of hardness, of really getting punched in the face, of getting choked out, of strangling, being strangled. As the poet, warrior, philosopher Mike Tyson said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face, and there's something very true about that. And that's very much the idea of shadow work. It's the archetypal hero's journey, going into the cave, confronting the dragon, which, again, the etymology of that is light, interestingly. So it's going into the cave, going into the darkness to face the dragon, which is light, the light reflected back at us. And so that's that idea of shadow work. This person also asked that he's seen other people speak of shadow work more in terms of the work, such as people like Byron Katie, Eckhart Tolle, and as he said, he sees parallels. And yes, I think it's essentially the same thing. I think Byron Katie says it very well, which is this idea, it's a practice of self-inquiry. And anything that's causing us pain, anything that's causing us suffering, maybe in a Buddhist sense, that which is causing us suffering, to question, to look at, to bring light to. But that means going into the darkness. That idea of suffering, dis-ease, is going into the darkness, and that we have to examine that. We have to look at that. We can't put it in a corner and not shine light on it, because it will stay with us. It can't be transmuted. It can't be transformed. And so she has a very, very simple and I think very sacred practice, which is, again, this idea when we're not well, um, when we experience something that feels not good, an emotion where we're feeling not good, that's a gateway, because the emotion is also a doorway into the mind. Um, I say not good also very specifically because I think we can boil down things to very simple ways of being, ways that we can even describe things to a child, because if we can't describe something to a child, then it ultimately means we don't have a mastery over it. And I think that's also a very vital thing to remember. Often we get conflated in ideas or complexities, but the most complex things, if we have an understanding of it, can be boiled down to very simple concepts. And so all of these ideas of trauma, patterning, conditioning, worldviews, cosmovisions, anything that's making us feel not good, that's something that needs to be examined. And so the emotion is a doorway. And so when we feel that, we can go to the mind. This is the system of Byron Katie, and examine the thought. And then we see that that thought is causing me to feel that way. And so the first questioning is this thought true? We're usually so lost in our mind, lost in our story, that we haven't even examined in that way. And so that begins to create space. The second question is, can I absolutely know that that's true? That begins to create more space, more distance between myself, who I am, and the thought. The third question, who would I be without that thought, without that belief? And usually the answer is something the opposite of that, the opposite of not good, free, light, joy. And then the fourth is a turnaround, which is this idea of, is the opposite true? And if the opposite is true, equally true or more true, then it means that thought is not true in an ultimate sense. And so why would I continue to hold on to it? And so as this person was saying, that's also a form of shadow work. It's a form of self-inquiry. And ultimately, all of these paths are moving towards the same place. I think it was Satchidananda who said, truth is one and paths are many. And so whether we're using a system of Byron Katie, of Eckhart Tolle, of Buddhism or Christianity or plant medicine paths, they're all pointing towards the same truth. And I know that may be a controversial statement. As I mentioned, I spent a lot of time with the Shipibo, and going back to etymology, I mentioned this a number of times in different podcasts, but I very much like how I understand their idea of good, because it has to do with this idea of truth. And on a deeper level, that which is life-giving. And so that which is life-giving is that which is true. That which is not true is not good. And it means it's not life-giving. It means it's divisive. It means it's separating. So any path or modality that's separating, that puts itself above another path, is feeding that energy. Any path that says it's the only way is feeding that untrue, unlife-giving, not good system. And so ultimately, this plant medicine path is a practice, a very direct way, a very direct practice. And so also those ideas of shadow work come up in the plant medicine path. And usually if you're working in a good setting with good people, with skilled people, with good medicines, it's an inevitable part of this journey, is these plants in that innate intelligence, in that life-giving energy, will take us into the darkness, will take us into the shadow, will take us into those aspects of all of the fears, the doubts, the anxieties, the things that we're holding on to, which are ultimately keeping us away from light, from God, from beauty, from truth, from that life-giving energy. And much like I gave with that example of the martial arts, the only way to embody that light is to go into the darkness. It's fundamental. That's the nature of this world. That's the nature of duality. We can't bypass that. And if we try, we don't succeed. And so the fundamental idea of shadow work is fundamental to this plant medicine path, to go into the darkness, to really know it, so that we know ourselves, so that we can transmute it, transcend it, and move towards towards the light.